December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. It was the coldest, most unforgiving winter Europe had seen in half a century. The snow was waist-deep, the fog was so thick it completely grounded the Allied Air Force, and out of that freezing white void came the last, desperate fury of the Nazi war machine. Hitler's final gamble. The Battle of the Bulge. The American lines were shattered. Tens of thousands of young soldiers were pushed back, captured, or slaughtered in the sudden, overwhelming German onslaught. But in the center of the chaos, one vital crossroads town refused to fall: Bastogne. Inside that frozen perimeter, the men of the 101st Airborne Division were completely surrounded. They had no winter clothing, no medical supplies, no air support, and barely enough ammunition to survive another night. The German army tightened the noose, demanding their immediate surrender. The situation wasn't just grim. It was a death sentence. On December 19th, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, convened an emergency meeting in a cold, damp, heavily guarded barracks in Verdun, France. The mood inside the room was suffocating. Defeat hung in the air like thick smoke. The top generals of the Allied forces stared silently at the massive map spread across the table. The red arrows of the German panzer divisions were slicing right through the heart of the American lines. The consensus among the high command was bleak. It would take weeks to mount a proper counteroffensive. The logistics alone made a rapid response entirely impossible. Moving an entire army in this weather, over frozen roads, while under heavy fire, was a military impossibility. The men trapped in Bastogne were effectively written off. They were dead men walking. Then General George S. Patton walked into the room. He didn't look defeated. He didn't look tired. Dressed immaculately, his polished helmet gleaming even in the dim light, his ivory-handled revolvers at his hips, Patton looked directly at the map. He didn't see a disaster. He saw a trap he could snap shut. But before Patton could speak, a senior general at the table shook his head, voicing the grim reality everyone else was already thinking. "Bastogne is lost," the general said, his voice heavy with resignation. "The 101st is surrounded by multiple panzer divisions. We cannot get to them in time. It is logistically impossible to turn an entire army around and punch through those German lines in this weather. We have to accept the reality. Bastogne cannot be saved." The war room went dead silent. No one moved. All eyes slowly turned to Patton. The heavy silence in the Verdun barracks was suffocating. Dozens of the highest-ranking Allied commanders, men who had orchestrated the liberation of entire countries, now stared at the floor or at the map, paralyzed by the logistical nightmare of the Ardennes. The snow was falling thicker outside. Time was running out for the 101st Airborne. The consensus was clear. The American army could not pivot fast enough to save Bastogne. It was a tragedy, but it was a military reality. Patton slowly took off his polished helmet and placed it on the wooden table. He didn't look at the senior general who had just pronounced the death sentence on his men. He kept his cold, piercing eyes locked onto the red markers surrounding Bastogne. "Impossible?" Patton's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the damp air of the room like a razor blade. He leaned forward, his hands resting heavily on the edges of the map. "Let me tell you what is impossible, General. It is impossible to ask American soldiers to hold the line in freezing temperatures without winter gear, without air cover, and without ammunition. But they are doing it. Right now. They are doing the impossible while we stand here in a heated room debating logistics." General Eisenhower, sitting at the head of the table, watched Patton intently. "George," Eisenhower interrupted gently but firmly. "The situation is critical. I need to know how long it will take for your Third Army to pivot north. We need a realistic counterattack. I am asking you to turn a force of hundreds of thousands of men, tanks, and artillery 90 degrees in the middle of the worst blizzard of the century." The other officers in the room exchanged nervous, cynical glances. Standard military doctrine dictated that such a massive maneuver would take at least a week, maybe two. The supply lines had to be completely redrawn. The fuel depots had to be relocated. The communication wires had to be laid fresh in the frozen mud. Doing it any faster would invite chaos, confusion, and catastrophic failure on icy, treacherous roads. Patton stood up straight. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying certainty. He looked directly into Eisenhower's eyes and delivered the words that would completely alter the course of the Second World War. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. A collective gasp rippled through the war room. Someone actually let out a nervous chuckle, assuming it was a joke. It was absurd. It was military suicide. One British officer leaned over and whispered to a colleague, "He's mad, it's physically impossible. He's just bragging for the audience." Patton's head snapped toward the whispering officer. The room instantly froze. Patton didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply stared down the officer who had whispered, his eyes narrowing with a predatory intensity until the man nervously looked away. The silence in the room grew so thick and oppressive it felt like it could crush the breath out of their lungs. Patton then turned his cold gaze back to General Eisenhower at the head of the table. 48 hours, Ike," Patton repeated, his voice absolute and unwavering. "I have 3 divisions ready to pivot right now. The 4th Armored, the 80th Infantry, and the 26th Infantry. We will disengage from our current front, turn 90 degrees to the north, and drive straight into the flank of the German panzer advance. We will shatter their lines and we will relieve the 101st Airborne in Bastogne." A senior logistics officer finally broke the frozen silence, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at the sprawling map. "General Patton, you are talking about moving over 100,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles in a blinding blizzard, over unmapped roads covered in black ice. You don't have the forward fuel depots set up for a move of that scale. Your men do not even have proper winter camouflage. You are risking the complete destruction of the entire Third Army on a reckless maneuver that has never been successfully executed in the history of modern warfare." Patton listened without blinking. He let the officer finish his frantic, desperate listing of military impossibilities. When the man finally sat back down, breathing heavily, Patton looked around the table at the high-ranking men who had already surrendered the 101st Airborne in their minds. "You are absolutely right, Colonel," Patton said, his tone completely devoid of any anxiety. "It has never been done, but we are not here to study military history. We are here to make it." He took a slow step closer to the map, his physical presence entirely dominating the war room. "While you gentlemen were in here debating logistics and preparing to write condolence letters to the mothers of the dead boys in Bastogne, I was on the radio. My staff has already drafted the movement orders. The operational code words have been distributed to the field commanders. The quartermasters have already begun redirecting the fuel trucks." The room was utterly stunned. The generals stared in sheer disbelief. Patton hadn't just walked in with a boastful, arrogant idea. He had already set the impossible in motion before he even entered the room. General Eisenhower stared at his most controversial, unpredictable, and brilliant commander. He knew Patton was a showman, a man who loved the theatricality of war. But he also knew Patton didn't bluff about logistics. If George Patton said the orders were given, the orders were given. A reluctant murmur of disbelief spread among the British and American staff officers. They were witnessing something that defied every established rule of military science. To pivot an entire army of hundreds of thousands of men, tanks, artillery, and supply lines 90 degrees in the middle of the most brutal winter in memory was a logistical nightmare. Doing it in 48 hours was considered sheer madness. Yet, looking into Patton's steel-cold eyes, Eisenhower finally nodded. "All right, George," Eisenhower said, his voice cutting through the nervous murmurs. "Attack." Within hours, the impossible began to take shape. Patton left the warm, comfortable headquarters in Verdun and plunged back into the freezing hell of the front lines. He didn't just give orders from a comfortable desk behind the lines. He drove up and down the icy, congested roads, personally directing traffic, screaming at military police, and ruthlessly pushing his men forward. The roads were a slick, treacherous nightmare of black ice and knee-deep snow. Massive Sherman tanks slid into ditches. Supply trucks broke down. Men suffered from severe frostbite, their boots freezing solid to their feet in the sub-zero temperatures. The blizzard showed absolutely no mercy, but Patton was everywhere. Standing in his open-cab Jeep, his face a mask of freezing fury, he demanded the impossible from his men, and miraculously they delivered. Meanwhile, inside the frozen perimeter of Bastogne, the situation for the 101st Airborne had deteriorated from desperate to apocalyptic. Ammunition was critically low, medical supplies were completely exhausted, surgeons were forced to operate on wounded men without anesthesia in freezing basements. The German commanders, completely confident of their absolute victory, had sent a formal demand for the Americans to surrender or face total annihilation. The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, famously replied with a single defiant word, "Nuts!" But pure defiance couldn't stop artillery shells, and it couldn't stop the freezing cold. The paratroopers huddled in their so-filled foxholes, their bodies shaking uncontrollably, looking up at the gray, heavily clouded sky, praying for a miracle. They had no idea that nearly 100 miles to the south, a miracle was currently tearing through the ice and snow to reach them. Patton's Third Army moved with a ferocious, terrifying speed that completely caught the German High Command off guard. The Nazis hadn't prepared for a massive armored thrust from the south because their own elite military intelligence had confidently deemed such a rapid maneuver physically impossible. But Patton didn't care about German intelligence, and he didn't care about the rules of modern warfare. He cared about crushing the enemy and saving his boys. And nothing, not the German army, not the freezing snow, and certainly not the doubts of his own superiors, was going to stop him. The march of the Third Army into the Ardennes became one of the most astonishing achievements in military history. Patton demanded his men push through a blinding blizzard, driving massive Sherman tanks and unarmored supply trucks over narrow roads that had turned into sheets of solid black ice. There was no time to sleep. There was no time for a hot meal. If a heavy truck broke down or slid off the treacherous path, it was violently shoved into the snowy ditch so the rest of the armored column could keep moving. If a man collapsed from severe frostbite or sheer exhaustion, he was pulled onto the freezing hood of a vehicle, and the relentless march continued without a single pause. Patton was an absolute terror on those frozen roads. Standing in his open-cab Jeep, the freezing wind and ice whipping against his face, he screamed orders, physically untangled massive logistical bottlenecks with his own hands, and explicitly threatened to relieve any commanding officer who dared slow the advance by even a minute. His men hated the biting cold, and they hated the agonizing exhaustion that seeped into their bones, but they did not hate him. Every single soldier in that freezing column knew exactly why they were being pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance. They knew the 101st Airborne was bleeding out in the frozen foxholes of Bastogne. They knew that if they stopped for even a moment, their brothers would be slaughtered. Inside Bastogne, the German artillery bombardment had intensified into a relentless, deafening nightmare. Medical supplies were so completely depleted that army surgeons were forced to use torn bed sheets for bandages and ration out single drops of morphine to men with missing limbs. The paratroopers were starving, hallucinating from the sub-zero cold and clutching their frozen M1 rifles with blackened, frost-bitten fingers. The German panzers were visibly massing on the tree line for the final, crushing blow. The Nazi commanders were absolutely confident that the brutal blizzard would keep the Allied planes permanently grounded, and that no army on Earth could possibly reach the town in time to save them. But they had fundamentally underestimated General George S. Patton. By the morning of December 22nd, defying every established law of physics, logistics, and military doctrine. The spearhead of the Third Army had traveled over 100 miles through the worst winter storm of the century. Operating purely on adrenaline, gasoline, and raw defiance, the first American tanks violently crashed into the outer ring of the German siege lines. The Nazi defenders were completely paralyzed by shock, unable to comprehend how an entire armored division had just materialized out of the freezing fog. The German commanders had meticulously planned for every possible variable, except one: the sheer, unadulterated willpower of George S. Patton. When the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division smashed into the southern flank of the German siege ring, it wasn't just a tactical surprise, it was a psychological earthquake. The Nazi forces, who had spent the previous week slowly and methodically suffocating the 101st Airborne, suddenly found themselves fighting desperately for their own survival. The battle in the frozen Ardennes became a nightmare of twisted steel and shattered ice. American Sherman tanks, their crews completely exhausted and half-frozen, fought with a savage, unrelenting desperation. They fired blindly into the thick white fog, guided only by the muzzle flashes of the enemy panzers. Infantrymen waded through waist-deep snowdrifts, their fingers so numb they could barely pull the pins on their grenades, clearing out German pillboxes and machine gun nests one brutal yard at a time. The pristine snow quickly turned black with soot, engine oil, and the blood of hundreds of men. Back at his mobile command post, Patton was orchestrating the chaos with the precision of a maestro conducting a symphony of destruction. He was constantly on the radio, bypassing traditional chains of command to speak directly to his tank commanders on the bleeding edge of the front line. When a battalion commander reported that the German resistance was too heavy and requested permission to temporarily halt and regroup, Patton's voice crackled over the radio with terrifying clarity. "There will be no halting. You will advance. If you cannot advance, you will die trying. But you will not stop until you see the paratroopers in Bastogne." Inside the besieged town, the men of the 101st Airborne heard a new, distinct sound echoing through the freezing fog. It wasn't the incoming high-pitched whistle of German artillery that they had grown so accustomed to. It was the deep, rhythmic, booming thud of American 75mm tank guns. The sound was coming from the south, and with every passing hour, it was getting louder. The starving, freezing paratroopers crawled out of their icy foxholes, looking toward the tree line with wide-eyed disbelief. Rumors spread like wildfire through the shattered, burning town. "It's the cavalry," one soldier whispered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Patton's actually coming." But the Germans weren't going to let their prized catch slip away so easily. Realizing that the entire American Third Army was crashing down on their flank and threatening to unravel Hitler's entire winter offensive, the Nazi High Command ordered their elite SS Panzer divisions to turn around. Their new orders were simple: annihilate Patton's spearhead before it could break the siege. The deadliest, most heavily armored tanks in the world were now rolling directly toward the exhausted Americans. Inside Bastogne, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne heard a new, distinct sound echoing through the freezing fog. It wasn't the incoming high-pitched whistle of German artillery that they had grown so accustomed to. It was the deep, rhythmic, booming thud of American 75mm tank guns. The sound was coming from the south, and with every passing hour, it was getting louder. The starving, freezing paratroopers crawled out of their icy foxholes, looking toward the tree line with wide-eyed disbelief. Rumors spread like wildfire through the shattered, burning town. "It's the cavalry," one soldier whispered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Patton's actually coming." But the Germans weren't going to let their prized catch slip away so easily. Realizing that the entire American Third Army was crashing down on their flank and threatening to unravel Hitler's entire winter offensive, the Nazi High Command ordered their elite SS Panzer divisions to turn around. Their new orders were simple: annihilate Patton's spearhead before it could break the siege. The deadliest, most heavily armored tanks in the world were now rolling directly toward the exhausted Americans. The German response was swift and terrifying. Elements of the 5th Panzer Army, veterans of the Eastern Front, slammed into the advancing American columns. The snowy fields south of Bastogne erupted into a chaotic, close-quarters slugfest. In the blinding whiteout, American Shermans found themselves suddenly face-to-face with massive German Tiger and Panther tanks. The heavier German armor usually dominated these encounters, but the Americans were fighting with a desperate, almost suicidal intensity. They weren't just fighting for ground. They were fighting for the lives of the men bleeding out just a few miles away. As the casualties mounted and the advance momentarily stalled under the blistering German counterattack, a young, exhausted American tank commander radioed back to headquarters, requesting permission to pull back behind a ridge to regroup. The men had been fighting non-stop for 2 days without sleep, and their vehicles were taking heavy fire. The radio crackled. It wasn't the battalion commander who answered. It was General George S. Patton himself, monitoring the forward frequencies from his command jeep just a few miles behind the line. "Negative," Patton's voice cut through the static, cold and absolute. "There will be no retreat. There will be no regrouping. You will hold that line, son, and you will advance. You will kill every goddamn German in your path, or you will die trying. But you will not stop until you are shaking hands with the 101st Airborne." The exhausted tank commander didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. When George Patton told you to advance into the jaws of death, you advanced. The young officer keyed his radio, ordering his battered column of Shermans to throttle up and drive straight into the blinding white fog. What followed was a brutal, mechanical slaughter in the frozen mud. The American tanks, outgunned and out-armored by the German Tigers, relied on sheer, suicidal speed and the absolute refusal to stop. They flanked the heavier German machines in the treacherous snow, trading point-blank fire that shattered the frozen silence of the Ardennes. Every mile gained was paid for in blood, burning steel, and frozen limbs. The SS Panzer divisions fought with the fanaticism of men who knew the war was lost if they failed. But the Americans fought with something far more dangerous, the terrified, ferocious desperation of men trying to save their brothers. Patton's relentless spirit had infected every single soldier in the Third Army. They were starving, they were freezing, and they were dying, but they did not stop moving north. By the late afternoon of December 26th, the distant booming thud of American 75mm guns had become a deafening roar right on the edge of Bastogne. Inside the perimeter, the men of the 101st Airborne crouched in their icy foxholes, clutching their empty rifles, watching the tree line erupt in fire and smoke. The German siege ring, which had held them in a death grip for a week, was visibly buckling. The Nazi infantry began to fall back, their lines fracturing under the relentless, crushing weight of Patton's armored spearhead. Then, through the thick, swirling snow and the black smoke of burning panzers, a silhouette emerged. It wasn't the boxy, terrifying shape of a German Tiger tank. It was the distinct, rounded hull of an American M4 Sherman, its tracks grinding through the frozen earth, its gun barrel still smoking. And behind it, another. And another. A shockwave of disbelief and pure, unadulterated adrenaline swept through the frozen foxholes of the 101st Airborne. Men who hadn't eaten in days, who couldn't feel their own feet, stood up in the crossfire, tears freezing to their dirt-caked faces, and began to scream. Patton's boys had actually done it. They had driven through the worst blizzard of the century, smashed through elite SS Panzer divisions, and broken the unbreakable siege. At his forward command post, Patton stood in the freezing cold, a lit cigar clenched in his teeth as the radio operator handed him the receiver. He received the transmission he had risked his entire army and his entire career to hear. The 4th Armored Division had officially made physical contact with the 101st Airborne. The corridor to Bastogne was finally open. The corridor was narrow, barely a mile wide, flanked by burning German armor and shattered pine trees, but it was open. The siege of Bastogne was broken. However, George S. Patton had no intention of celebrating his impossible victory from a comfortable command post. He wanted to look the men of the 101st Airborne in the eye. On December 30th, his open-cab Jeep rolled through the frozen, devastated streets of the town. Bastogne was a graveyard of rubble, twisted metal, and frozen blood. The stench of cordite and death hung heavy in the sub-zero air. As Patton's vehicle slowly navigated the wreckage, the battered, starving paratroopers emerged from their ruined cellars and icy foxholes. They were wrapped in filthy, blood-stained blankets, their faces hollowed out by extreme exhaustion and hunger, their eyes wide and haunted from weeks of relentless shelling. They stood in the freezing wind, watching the three-star general pass. Patton, standing tall in the Jeep, his ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his waist, didn't offer a triumphant, arrogant smile. He looked at the freezing, unbroken men with absolute, silent reverence. The sheer magnitude of their endurance was something even he, a man who had seen brutal combat across 2 continents, struggled to fully comprehend. Patton ordered his driver to stop outside the heavily sandbagged basement that served as the 101st Airborne's headquarters. He walked down the dark, freezing steps and into the dim, candle-lit room. There, standing over a map table, was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the man who had famously told the surrounding German army to go to hell. McAuliffe looked up, his uniform unwashed, his face pale and drawn from days without sleep. The 2 commanders stared at each other for a long moment. There was no formal saluting, no grand speeches for the press. Patton stepped forward, the heavy thud of his polished boots echoing in the quiet, damp basement. He didn't speak of his own impossible logistical triumph, nor did he boast about the terrifying speed of his Third Army's advance. Instead, he looked at McAuliffe with a profound, uncharacteristic humility. "General," Patton said, his voice thick with a raw emotion he rarely showed to anyone, "you and your boys have just accomplished one of the greatest defensive stands in the history of the United States Army. We didn't come here to rescue you. We came here to have the honor of fighting alongside you." The men of the 101st Airborne were proud, hardened warriors. Even starving, freezing, and entirely surrounded by a vastly superior force, they had never once considered themselves defeated. They despised the word rescue. To them, a rescue implied they had been broken, that they were helpless victims waiting to be saved. Patton, with his brilliant, intuitive understanding of the combat soldier's mind, knew exactly what they needed to hear. By telling General McAuliffe that the Third Army was there simply for the honor of fighting alongside them, Patton didn't just break the physical siege of Bastogne, he immortalized their legendary defiance. He validated every drop of blood they had spilled in the frozen mud. Word of what Patton said in that dark, sandbagged basement spread through the ruined streets of Bastogne within hours. The battered paratroopers, wrapping their frost-bitten hands around hot cups of coffee brought in by the Third Army's supply trucks, felt a profound psychological shift. The terrifying isolation of the past week completely evaporated. They were no longer alone at the edge of the world. The full, terrifying weight of the American military had moved heaven and earth to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. The relief of Bastogne effectively broke the back of Hitler's Ardennes offensive. The German army, having exhausted its final reserves of elite armor and manpower against the unbreakable will of the 101st Airborne and the unstoppable momentum of Patton's Third Army, was forced into a permanent, devastating retreat. The Nazi war machine would never mount another major offensive. The war in Europe was entering its final, bloody chapter. Military historians would spend the next century dissecting Patton's maneuver. They would study the logistics, the fuel consumption, the road networks, and the impossible timelines, trying to understand how an entire army pivoted 90 degrees in 48 hours in the middle of a catastrophic blizzard. But the men who were there didn't need a textbook to explain it. If you ask the survivors of Bastogne how they made it out of that frozen hell, they won't talk about supply chains or strategic doctrines. They will tell you about the blinding fog, the overwhelming odds, and the terrifying silence of the snow. And then they will tell you about the distant, thudding sound of American 75mm guns getting louder and louder. They will tell you that when the entire world had written them off as dead men, George S. Patton looked at a map, defied the Supreme Allied Command, and drove an armored army through the worst winter of the century. He didn't do it for the glory. He didn't do it for the medals. He did it because his men were trapped in the dark, and he absolutely refused to let the snow bury them.